This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I'm going to do something that I don't normally do on the show today, and I'm going to respond to a conversation that took place on another podcast about the faith of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And that podcast is actually a very famous podcast called The Holy Post, and it was a podcast that was started by Phil Vischer, who is the creator of the VeggieTales animated series. And he was having a conversation with a couple of regular contributors, co-hosts, whatever you want to call it. There are a lot of people that contribute regularly to The Holy Post because, like I said, it's a pretty big show. Skye Jethani is one of the co-hosts, and I apologize to Skye if I'm mispronouncing his last name. And then Katlyn, Schiess, who is an author and I think a graduate PhD student at Duke University, if I remember correctly. But they had a conversation about her new book, The Bible and the Ballot Box, which looks really interesting. But I think that they missed the point in a pretty big way when they talked about George W. Bush and Barack Obama and their Christian faith. And I wanted to correct the record and then also make sure that I give context for why I found their omission of the problems with the Bush and the Obama administration so grievous, and how I think that's indicative of larger cultural and political problems within American Christianity. But I got to say from the very start here that I'm not, this is not a critique of the Holy Post. I have nothing but respect for Phil Vischer, and there are a lot of really great contributors to that show. You have people like Mike Bird, who is a New Testament scholar who's been very influential to me, Carmen Joy Imes, who's on my show just a few weeks back, really, really great Old Testament scholar. You have people like Scott McKnight and Justin Brierley, like a lot of really great people contribute to this show. And I have nothing but respect for these people. I mean, Phil Vischer is the guy that created VeggieTales. And anyone like me that grew up in church in the late 90s and early 2000s, like everyone loves VeggieTales. It's one of the greatest children's shows ever made. So what I'm going to do here is I'm not trying to criticize them or be disrespectful towards them at all. I just think that the way that they approached the problem, this wasn't even really a problem for them. I think that the way that they approach Bush and Obama is deeply problematic. And I want to address exactly why I think that that was so problematic. And I've wanted to do an episode for a long time on the war crimes of both Bush and Obama. And this just seemed like a really great opportunity to do that. So the Holy Post is the podcast deals with a lot of political issues. And one of the things that I appreciate about it, even though I'm not like a regular listener, I'll listen if they have on somebody that I really like. So I occasionally from time to time, I'll download it and listen to it, especially if the topic's interesting. But one of the things that I like about the Holy Post is that they are Christians that are not like openly progressive. So they haven't rejected evangelicalism, at least not in the way that some of the more openly progressive Christians have. And they also are not like fundamentalist conservatives either. So on their show, they address a lot of very important political topics, and they try to add a layer of nuance and thoughtfulness into those topics that you don't get with a lot of Christians. And for that, I have a lot of respect. And they do indeed raise a lot of very important questions. There's no denial about that whatsoever. I don't always agree with the answer to those questions because they don't have, obviously, a libertarian framework, even though there are a lot of cases. And I even think that Katlyn Schiess, who is on there, The Bible and the Ballot Box, looking at her new book, it maybe seems like in a lot of ways it might accidentally be libertarian. And I think that there's a lot that I can agree with. So I appreciate the fact that these people are trying to inject a little bit of nuance into conversations where there often isn't any. But the other side of that is that I think that it creates a situation on the show sometimes where they treat politics kind of like a buffet, where they're explicitly not to the left or to the right, and they'll go out of their way to say, well, on certain issues I align with the right, and on certain issues I align with the left, and that's very commendable, and that was kind of the way that I was before I found libertarian philosophy. But obviously, I would say that at the end of the day, a lot of the policy positions that they subscribe to on the show are contradictory philosophically. And we're going to get into some of that in a couple of minutes. Now, I want to kind of explore that dynamic and see what it looks like. So they obviously have these conversations that we're going to discuss on the show today about Bush and Obama. And before we get to that, though, they had a really interesting conversation about a new song that I'm sure you've heard by Oliver Anthony. It's called Richmond, North of Richmond. I haven't listened to the song. I know that everyone has. It's been very controversial, but I have a personal policy where I just refuse to engage in any media that somebody tells me I have to engage in. And I really don't think that a lot of these politicized, entertainment options or opportunities, I don't think that a lot of them are usually worth much of my time. But they talk about that a little bit, and the way that they address that song on the show is, I think, indicative of the kinds of problems that I'm going to be identifying later on when we talk about the way that they approach Bush and Obama. So I'm going to play a couple clips from this episode just by way of introduction. So here's what they had to say about this song.
Popular media. We've had a couple of things happen this summer that have become, one is a song, one is a movie, that have become, I would say, Rorschach tests amazingly, for your politics of all things. Either you think these movies are the best thing ever, or you think these movies are a sign that the country is just completely off the rails and people are going crazy. Okay, the song is Richmond, North of Richmond by Oliver Anthony.
A very good title.
Spoiler, not his real name.
Okay, so I'm sure most of you guys that are listening to this show have heard that song and are familiar with the song. I've not listened to it. I have no plans on listening to it. I don't really engage with a lot of American popular culture because I just don't care. Like, I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't watch a lot of movies. I don't listen to popular music. So these things don't really bother me. And as a libertarian, I'm somebody that believes that if there is a movie or a television show, whether it's Barbie or The Sound of Freedom or whatever, which I haven't seen any of them and I have no plans to ever watch any of them. But if I know that I'm not going to like the message of a movie or a song, I just don't watch it or listen to it. It's easy, right? So instead of arguing about it and complaining about it and whining about it, like, just if you don't like it, don't listen to it. But they have a really interesting analysis about the lyrics of the song. And basically, from what I understand, I've seen the lyrics to the song and they have talked about it on other podcasts that I listen to, like Part of the Problem. Dave Smith had a riff on this song a couple of weeks ago. And basically, it's a song where the artist is complaining about the Richmond, north of Richmond, Virginia, I guess, which are the people in Washington, D.C. So it's a complaint against our politicians. So they have a very interesting interpretation of what that song means on the Holy Post. So I want to play a clip of their discussion about the meaning of this song, and I want to break it down and kind of explain why I think it's such a problem. And I think that we're going to be able to see, once I do that, how this ties into my criticism of the way that they handled George Bush and Barack Obama. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
Before that, my dumb take on this is I think the appeal of the song is not that it's rallying against the rich men north of Richmond. It's really, it's a zero-sum argument saying that the government is helping. I mean, the code language here, or the dog whistle, is the government is helping black urban people who are poor at the expense of white rural people who are poor. And so the attitude is, if people of color or immigrants have opportunities or gain jobs and wealth, it must be coming at the expense of poor white citizens. That's the argument of this song. They're not saying rich people are getting richer at the expense of the poor. They're saying poor white people are staying poor while poor black people are getting handouts.
Okay, so that was Skye Jethani, who is an author and a pastor. And all of the people that are on the show are obviously much more intelligent than I am. I have no problem admitting that whatsoever. But I really think that this is quite a horrible take for a couple of reasons. Number one, I really hate the fact that in modern political discourse, anytime somebody disagrees with you politically or says something that you don't like, we have to bring it back to race. And he just assumes, based on the lyrics of the song, that if the songwriter is criticizing the welfare state, that it must be an implicit critique or a dog whistle of black culture. And that's just ridiculous. And I have no idea where this guy, Jethani, lives. I'm not sure if he lives on the coast or in a city or whatever. But in southern states like Kentucky, where I live, and I guess like Virginia, where Oliver Anthony is from, I'm assuming. I'm not actually sure. He's obviously from a southern state somewhere. The majority of the people that are on welfare in our states are white. They're not black at all. And so it's very interesting to me that he would assume that a critique of the welfare state automatically has something to do with racialism, when in reality, that's just not the case for most of us. But I really do. And there's something really interesting about that, because I think that if you are that focused on race, then it actually makes you kind of racist. And I'm not saying that he is like a racist. I'm sure he's a very nice and very open and very tolerant person. I'm sure he absolutely 100% is. But like as a libertarian, I don't view race in structural terms like the critical theorists do. I view race in individual categories because I'm an individualist. A racist is somebody that does not like somebody else because of the color of their skin. It's that simple. And we cannot collapse all of our critiques of the welfare system, which is what people on the left do all the time. We cannot collapse all of our critiques of the welfare system back into race. And now I do think that there's a very good argument to be made that in the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson unveiled his plans for the Great Society, which is the foundation of the modern welfare state, that he was probably trying to buy the votes of black people. And I really do believe that, as Thomas Sowell has demonstrated over and over again in his excellent work, that this welfare system created a set of incentives that held back the black community. And I think that there's a lot of statistical evidence that backs that point up. So I think that we can have an honest conversation, or we should be able to have an honest conversation in this country about welfare and the merits of welfare and the incentive structures that welfare creates and whether or not welfare is actually delivering on what it was intended to deliver, without having to assume that anyone that has a different perspective than you on welfare is automatically a racist, which is exactly what Skye did. And I think that that's completely unfair. And again, I'm not saying that he's a bad person at all. And I'm not saying that he even intended to be this critical in that sense. But this is what's so frustrating, is that the mainstream narrative from the political class and the media class is that we have to focus on race, which makes it impossible for us to have technical, nuanced conversations about very complicated issues like welfare. And I think that this is a very great example of that. And the other thing is too, and this is where like, you know, kind of the critical theory mindset of trying to expose power relations and all texts. You know, this goes back to Jacques Derrida and his philosophy of deconstruction, not like deconstruction in the Christian sense, but deconstructing a text to find the implicit power dynamics that are embedded within it. I think that this is where that has completely infected our ability to like just accurately and adequately assess what somebody is saying. Because notice, like the author of the song in no way says anything about black people at all. But Skye feels that he's justified in reading that into there's a dog whistle. But there's nothing to back that up other than the fact that the mainstream media does not want us to, and the political class does not want us to have an honest conversation about the welfare state, because they all benefit from that, and the politicians benefit from giving free things to people. So that's my critique. Very interesting. Phil Vischer pushes back on this. Let's play his response.
And where in the song did he say that?
Because it talks about, hold on, let me pull up my lyrics somewhere.
It talks about welfare recipients.
Yeah, but that's always been code language since the 1980s for people of color.
Do you think he's coding that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's kind of, it's an urban, he's comparing people who take welfare, I'm using air quotes because that's usually urban people of color, from poor white people who need more help. And so it felt like a song that's juxtaposing one group against another. It's not rich, powerful against poor and destitute. It's one set of needy people against another set of needy people.
Again, I think that that's just such a disingenuous way of looking at this. It's just not true. And again, there are more white Americans that are on welfare than there are black Americans. And so it's very interesting, again, that Skye would make the assumption that when somebody from a red state, where the majority of the people that are on welfare are white, would automatically equate welfare with black people. And what does it say about him that in his mind, he just assumes that the mental framework that those of us that criticize the welfare system have for the average welfare recipient is somebody who is black? That's just not the case. And when I was growing up, I knew a lot of people that were on welfare, and almost all of them were white. And I taught in an inner city school. There are a couple of cities in Kentucky. I taught in an inner city school for 2 years where there were people of all different colors that received welfare. Not once in my life have I ever thought that welfare was something that was indicative of the black community, and I don't think that Oliver Anthony did either. And so the problem that I have with this is that even though I think that Skye is genuinely trying to make an argument that he thinks is morally justifiable on this program, what he's doing is he's taking the mainstream conversation, he's taking the mainstream narrative about these things, everything is reducible to race, and applying it to this song, which is just not the case. And in reality, he might not think that Anthony Oliver has a good take on welfare. Maybe he thinks the welfare state is acceptable and good and meets its goals. I don't really know what Skye's position on welfare is, but we can't just reduce it to race. And this is one way that I think the our mainstream conception of left-right politics, even though I think the Holy Post in general tries to bring, like I said before, they try to bring more nuance into the conversation. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they're still playing within the confines of the left-right spectrum, the index card of allowable opinion that we are allowed to have about certain issues in the United States. There was one other mention, I think, that Katlyn makes of a lyric in the song that has to do with Jeffrey Epstein. I think we need to listen to that because this is another thing that we need to hear that's going to set us up for our conversation about the war crimes of Bush and Obama and about the reason why the Holy Post missed that entirely. Let's listen to this. Let's listen to this part of the show.
Okay, the stanza, and I agree 100% with what Katlyn just said. The stanza that I think really captures this, I just pull up the lyrics, says, "I wish politicians would look out for minors." Minors we generally associate as rural white people. Mm-hmm. And not just minors on an island somewhere. Minors, M-I-N-O-R-S, meaning kids, right? Foreign workers or immigrants.
No, Jeffrey
And
Epstein.
then it says, Lord, we got
that means Jeffrey Epstein and the minors that they wanted to have sex with on his.
Is that what
I
he's
really
talking
think there's
about?
a Q-Anon thing going on here.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a
okay.
Jeffrey Epstein reference.
Very interesting. Notice what Katlyn says about that line in the song that explicitly talks about Jeffrey Epstein. She says that is a, quote, QAnon thing. Isn't that really strange? Because I don't think that, now obviously there are some people out there that are, if QAnon even exists in the way that the mainstream media seems to think that it does, which I don't believe that it does. I think that I think it's dramatically blown out of proportion. There are people that have crazy conspiracy theories about Jeffrey Epstein, but we do know that he was doing nefarious things on his island that involve minors. That's just an empirical fact. And so when somebody like Anthony Oliver records a song that deals directly with that issue, we can't just say, oh, that's a QAnon thing, and we're not really going to explore it. I mean, we all know that Jeffrey Epstein didn't commit suicide. I'm sorry, like he didn't. There are just too many circumstances that had to have lined up perfectly in order for that to be a suicide. The cameras weren't on, the guards were asleep, he's in a jail cell, he somehow magically has the ability to hang himself. Like, none of that makes sense. And we knew that he consorted with very rich and powerful people, including presidents like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. There's something going on there. What's amazing to me about the mainstream media, and this is the perfect segue into the next part of this podcast. What's amazing to me about the mainstream media is that they give us a very small window of issues that we are allowed to address and debate. We can talk about racism. And well, I mean, it's really, that's it. We can talk about racism, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about classism, we can talk about those kinds of things. But we're not allowed to talk about Jeffrey Epstein. And it's crazy and wild that there are Christians that claim to be committed to social justice. All they say is that we need to have justice and we need to have equity, that aren't even curious at all about how the wealthiest and most powerful people in our country all have some sort of connection to Jeffrey Epstein, who was convicted for child sex trafficking. That's wild to me. And it's wild that they wouldn't press that forward, and that her only comment about this is that it's related to the QAnon conspiracy theory. Just completely amazing. Now, again, I want to say this as we move into the next part of the show, because this was really the rub for me as I was listening to this episode. For as much as I appreciate Vischer and Skye and the woman who wrote the book, Katlyn, as much as I appreciate them trying to analyze these issues, they're analyzing these issues within the framework that is given to us by mainstream discourse. So it's not really like a ruthless biblical interrogation of these issues. And it's not really a philosophical or an economic critique of these systems. These are the kind of things that we're taught and trained by the media and by the political class to say about these issues. Again, the Jeffrey Epstein thing is just wild to me because it's such an egregious miscarriage of justice, and no one seems to be interested in it at all, including them. Now, this is where, I think it's really interesting that our politics and even the politics of the Holy Post, yes, they're not progressive, heroically not progressive, and heroically not like fundamentalist conservative. That's a very precarious position to take in this day and age. And so we shouldn't underestimate or we shouldn't minimize the degree to which this is a virtue that they're cultivating there. And I really appreciate that. But all of their political perspectives up to this point fall into the left-right binary. There are some things that we are allowed to talk about, and there are some things that we are not allowed to talk about. And this demonstrates to me that there's almost a complete failure to dissent from any sort of mainstream conceptions of what could and could not be possibly happening in the world. Again, the fact that we do not have Jeffrey Epstein's client list is one of the greatest injustices that has taken place in the last 4 years, in a time where many great injustices have taken place. And I think that this is just a really interesting position that we're in. And the conversation that they're going to have where they talk about Katlyn Schiess's new book, The Bible in the Ballot Box. They're going to talk about the prayer life of George Bush and his spirituality, his Christian faith. And they're going to talk about the Christian faith of Barack Obama. And so when we have conversations about presidents, there are certain things that we are allowed to say. There are certain parameters that the mainstream media and that the political class have set for us to discuss. We can criticize their personality. We can criticize their family members. We can discuss whether or not they were good for certain races or sexes or classes. But we can't push very hard on the fact that, like, the most important thing that we have to remember about all of these presidents is that they're all war criminals, which is what I want to talk about on the show today. They're all war criminals, every single one of them. And so the fact that we can sit back and have a casual conversation about the policies of George Bush and about the policies of Barack Obama as Christians without bringing up the fact that they both deserve to be thrown in prison for what they've done to people in the Middle East is indicative of the fact that our society and like these predominantly elite cultural values are dominating our ability to have conversations, because everything like Jeffrey Epstein's island is automatically labeled or is automatically labeled or put in alignment with a conspiracy theory. And any substantial conversation about welfare or pay gaps or anything like that it always devolves into a race, class, sex conversation instead of actually debating the issues substantially. And I think that this is exactly the kind of culture that has been created by our media. And again, I appreciate that the Holy Post has pushed back on that to a certain extent, but they're still operating within the parameters that are set by the most powerful people in our entire society. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So in the second half of this Holy Post episode, which I hope you guys go and listen to, they have a conversation about her new book, The Bible in the Ballot Box, and they talk about Romans 13, and they talk about slavery, and they talk about the way that people interpret the Bible politically. And there's a lot of I added this book to my to read list on Amazon. I got a lot I got to read for the podcast and just some personal things, and I got to do some more research on the Middle Ages for work. So, but I do plan on trying to read this book before the end of the year. And I think that, like, a lot of the people that are associated with the Holy Post, whose work I have followed, in a lot of ways, what she says in this book, it seems to be very much in alignment with libertarian philosophy. Like, there's a lot that I think that listeners of this show would appreciate if they listened to this, if they read this book. So I'm excited for that. So again, I don't want this to be a criticism. I'm not trying to be rude or disrespectful. I think she's very bright, and I think she has a lot of really great perspectives. But they really drop the ball when they talk about Bush and Obama. So I want to introduce that part of the conversation to you guys, and then we're going to do this. We're going to do this in two sweeps here. I'm going to play the clip of the clip where they discuss George W. Bush and his prayer life, and then we're going to talk about some of George Bush's war crimes, and then we're going to play the clip where they talk about Barack Obama, and then we're going to discuss some of his war crimes. There's a couple of really great articles that highlight this that I want to give to you guys, because I think it's very important to have the statistics, especially if we're Christians and we're concerned about justice and we're concerned about truth and all of those things that are incredibly important. We should actually have that information available to us. And then we're going to kind of sum it all up, and I'm going to tell you what I think about all of this, and we'll wrap this up with a nice little bow at the end here. So here's the beginning of the conversation that they had about the spirituality of George W. Bush and Barack Obama.
But then you have a chapter very recent about the way George W. Bush and Barack Obama both used the Bible in their presidencies. And we don't talk about this because it feels too recent maybe to think about it. But this chapter fascinated me.
I just want to say at the outset here, too, before we play the clip on George Bush, that I do not care what my politicians believe theologically. Like, it doesn't matter to me at all. The only thing that matters is what they do when they are in leadership. That's it. It's all about the decisions that they've made. And politicians have always cynically used and exploited Christianity to try to gain votes. I mean, this is really how the rise of the religious right in the 1980s with the moral majority took place. There was this giant evangelical voting bloc in the 1960s and 70s that didn't have a home, and the Republicans figured out how to cater to that segment of the population in order to buy their votes. And I know that there were a lot of true believers in that moral majority movement, but at the end of the day, it was just another cynical ploy, in the same way that I think welfare was a cynical ploy in the 1960s to get one segment of the population to vote for you. And in my opinion, I don't want my political leaders to tell me anything about theology or about their doctrines or about their beliefs. Like, if you say that you read the Bible, okay, prove it by the way that you treat other people in your personal life, and prove it by the decisions that you make when you are in office. Like, that is the gold standard. And so as we talk about Bush and Obama and the war crimes that they very obviously committed, and I know that if, maybe you're listening to this podcast, you've never heard any other episodes of my show before, and so it might even be grating to you if you're familiar with if you're not familiar with my show and with my perspective on warfare. It might even be grating for you to hear me call Bush and Obama war criminals, but we have to be objective about this. And I hope that by the end of the episode, you will have learned something that will help you contextualize just how horrible these people are. So again, both Bush and Obama, they are going to appeal, as we'll see here, to the Bible. They're going to appeal to their faith, but then they're also going to be responsible for the deaths of literally millions of people in the Middle East. Let's go ahead and take a look at George W. Bush, the architect of the War on Terror.
Start off with just describe, there's so much to unpack here. Generally describe how Bush and Obama both talked about their faith and talked about scripture.
Yes. So for this chapter, I looked at some other things, but I especially focused on the 8 prayer breakfast speeches that both of them had, because it was just an easy way to compare. Okay, you each had 8 speeches. This is kind of the moment where the president gets to use the most explicitly religious language, address religious people. And so Bush and Obama had very different approaches. Bush, which often people will think of as like super Christian, super religious president. That's the kind of, Al Mohler said that at the time. People say it still today. Other than Reagan, probably the most kind of conservative Christian, he's our guy kind of person. And yet Bush's his faith was incredibly personal. He didn't talk about it a lot. He actually never in any of his 8 prayer breakfast speeches said the name of Jesus Christ. Which is crazy. He talked a lot about kind of general sovereignty. He talked a lot about our faith that we share. He relied on a really kind of civic religion way of describing this. We all sort of believe the same things. He occasionally referenced other religions, but he really focused on our similarities. The Abrahamic faiths. We all kind of believe the same things. I don't think that's true, but that's kind of the way that he would talk about it. And he really relied, when it came to voters and elections, on identity. I'm one of you. I have a conversion story that fits evangelical expectations. I really play up that it was Billy Graham that helped me become a Christian. And
he famously, in the 2000 election, I remember this vividly, he was being interviewed and some journalist asked him I think the question was, what political philosopher is most influenced you? And he said, Jesus Christ, because he changed my heart. And that was like, it wasn't a dog whistle. It was just a whistle that said to every voter out there, I'm an evangelical like you.
Yes. And afterwards, when he was asked about that, his description was very like, I just wanted people to know like what personally motivated me. It wasn't about my politics. It wasn't about some kind of like public thing. It was just, this is what comforts me. He talked a lot about those kinds of things. This gives me personal comfort. This gives me personal guidance.
Ooh, okay. Where to begin? Man, there's really a lot of directions that we could go here. The thing that I want all of my listeners to do, if you have not read Scott Horton's Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terror, it's the greatest book on modern U.S. foreign policy ever written. Go to Amazon, buy yourself a copy of that book, and you will know more than nearly everybody else in America about our foreign terror wars. It's incredibly well sourced, incredibly well written, and explains exactly how corrupt and entangled the United States government is in Middle Eastern politics. And it's been this way for a very, very long time. So in a lot of ways, Bush didn't really begin the war on terror. When he became president of the United States, he inherited a long tradition of American foreign policy that had been entangled in Middle Eastern politics for a very long time. And the thing about that is that when you have a giant imperial country like the United States involved in the domestic politics of countries that are far, far away, those people are going to wind up resenting you. And Osama bin Laden was a prime example of that. Throughout the 1990s, he resented the fact that the United States had a very comfortable relationship with the Saudis and had military bases in Saudi Arabia. He resented the fact that the United States backed Israel and the way that the Israelis treated the Arab Palestinians. He resented the fact that the United States had spent the 1990s bombing and putting sanctions on Iraq that had resulted in the death of like nearly 500,000 completely innocent people in Iraq. Those were the things that made Osama bin Laden angry with the United States. It wasn't our freedom. It wasn't women wearing blue jeans. It wasn't country music and rock and roll and Bud Light. It wasn't any of those things. The reason why he was frustrated with the United States is because of our foreign policy, which has always been involved, at least since the end of World War II, intimately involved in Middle Eastern politics. So you have 9/11 that happened, and immediately after that, what does the Bush administration do? They invade Afghanistan. But there were a lot of problems with this because going back into the 90s, there was a group of people called the neoconservatives, and there was an organization called the Project for a New American Century. And this is all outlined in Scott Horton's book, by the way, so you have to go get yourself a copy of it. It's so important that we hear his argument. But there were all these neoconservatives in the 1990s that had drawn up plans to invade Iraq. They felt like Iraq War I under George H.W. Bush had been a blown opportunity, that we hadn't gone far enough to take Saddam Hussein out of power, and these guys were just chomping at the bit to go over and get Saddam Hussein out of power in Iraq. And Paul Wolfowitz was one of the founders of the Project for a New American Century, and he wound up being, I think, the Undersecretary of State in the Bush administration. And there were a lot of people within the Bush administration that were these neoconservatives that were connected to think tanks like the Project for a New American Century. Every single one of them wanted to invade Iraq. They wanted a war in the Middle East. A lot of these people also had contacts with defense contractors and defense companies. In fact, George W. Bush's vice president, Dick Cheney, was the CEO of a company called Halliburton that had a subsidiary defense company. And when we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, that Halliburton got a lot of money from the government to help build bridges and do other things over there. So there were all these people that wanted war, that were connected to the defense companies that would make money if we got ourselves into a war. And 9/11 was like being handed an opportunity on a plate to the Bush administration. And so George Bush immediately invades Afghanistan. The problem with that, because Osama bin Laden was said to be hiding out in the Tora Bora Mountains in the eastern part of Afghanistan, on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we invade the country. But what the Bush administration immediately did was they equated the de facto government of Afghanistan, which was the Taliban, with Al-Qaeda, who was Osama bin Laden's outfit that was responsible for the 9/11 terror attacks. And they used that equivocation as a justification for a full-scale invasion of the country of Afghanistan. But Afghanistan was not responsible at all for 9/11, and neither was the Taliban. And that's not to say that the Taliban are full of good people. They're not, especially by modern Western standards, but it wasn't their fault. And they were willing in their own way to work with the Bush administration to try to get Osama bin Laden out of the eastern part of their country. I mean, there were a lot of people in the Taliban that were very uncomfortable with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda being in eastern Afghanistan. But the Bush administration refused to play ball with them and then used this equivocation as a pretext for a full-scale invasion and occupation of the country. Congress never declared war, and we spent 20 years illegally occupying a sovereign nation because Osama bin Laden was in the Tora Bora Mountains at the very beginning of our occupation. Scott Horton has a really interesting passage in Enough Already where he talks about how in the fall of 2001, headed up into October, November, and I think at the very beginning of December, the United States military and some Taliban forces had Osama bin Laden pinned down in the Tora Bora Mountains, right? Like they had this guy dead to rights, but they needed some more soldiers. And so there were several field commanders that asked the Bush administration to send a couple of more contingents of soldiers into the eastern part of Afghanistan to help them smoke out Osama bin Laden and kill him, because that was the mission objective. And for whatever reason, the Bush administration refused to do that. And Osama bin Laden was able to slip away through the mountains into Pakistan, where he hid for another 10 years until he was killed by the Obama administration. So it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder why the Bush administration, whose stated goal on day one, by the way, like when September 11th happened, it wasn't, we're going to go kill Osama bin Laden because he did this, which it would have been an appropriate and proportional response. His approach was, we are going to wage a war on terror. We're going to make sure that this never happens again, and this is going to be a long war, and we're going to get entangled in any regime, any country that has any sort of sympathy for the terrorist. And then what happens a couple of years after this? So we illegally occupy Afghanistan. The Bush administration does this. Congress gives them an authorization for use of military force, but it's not a formal declaration of war. And they lied to us about the involvement of the Taliban in 9/11. They just weren't responsible for it in any way. And Saddam Hussein was in the exact same boat in Iraq. So in 2003, in 2003, the Bush administration literally fabricated the idea that the Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction and that Saddam Hussein was willing to use them. There was no evidence for that whatsoever. There were some think tanks, some neoconservative connected think tanks that published papers that suggested that he might have a nuclear weapons program, but it was all based on sketchy data and on sketchy information. But George Bush had already committed to this global war on terror, and so we didn't even need a justification. So he got another authorization for the use of military force in Iraq, and then we illegally invaded Iraq on the pretext that they had weapons of mass destruction, in which it was proved later on that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Just the Bush administration lied to us so that we could go over and invade a sovereign country. And again, this is not to say that Saddam Hussein is a good guy. I'm not making that argument at all. He's a horrible human being, but he wasn't responsible for 9/11. He did not blow up the World Trade Center. He didn't sponsor any of the terrorists that flew those planes. And notice too, like when we invaded Iraq, is bombs over Baghdad. I mean, I remember watching this on TV in 2003. They blew up water treatment facilities. The Bush administration did. They blew up bridges. They deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure because they wanted to send a message to the people of Iraq. And then we, after illegally invading it, illegally occupied the country for another decade for nothing. For no reason. There were no weapons of mass destruction there. And as a result of this war on terror, we also have the Bush administration implementing the Patriot Act, which allowed the Department of Defense and the CIA and other intelligence agencies to spy on American citizens without their consent, clear violation of the Constitution. And the Bush administration also redefined torture. It wasn't torture anymore. It was enhanced interrogation. And so in CIA and DoD black sites all over the world, we illegally kidnapped people that weren't even soldiers, people that weren't even fighting, people that just happened to be on the wrong side of the American military machine, and we tortured them for information. And all of this was done with the complete knowledge and approval of the Bush administration. All of these are crimes against humanity, absolutely unconscionably crimes against humanity. And this brings me to my problem with this approach here. Like, sure, like on the Holy Post podcast, you can talk about, George Bush's faith or whatever, but it doesn't really matter what his faith is because he illegally invaded two countries and burned them to the ground, killing hundreds of thousands of people, killing hundreds of thousands of people in the process. Hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of those two wars. And then we got the Patriot Act, which was a giant expansion of the power of our deep state, and it was a giant expansion of the power of the spying apparatus used against the American people. And then we also got the torture programs. And I talked about this on an earlier episode of the show. I'll try to put a link to it in the show notes. But if you want to learn more about the George Bush torture programs that Obama did nothing to stop, by the way, you need to go back and listen to that episode. But these are the war crimes of George W. Bush. And to sit back, and again, we're not allowed to say this. We're not allowed to say this about presidents. We can criticize their policies, we can criticize their personality, but we cannot call them war criminals. But that's exactly what they are. And as Christians, having a conversation about George Bush's faith and about how he never used the word Jesus at the national prayer, that is such a that misses the point. It's just like connecting Jeffrey Epstein with Q-Anon theory. Okay, so maybe there are some Q-Anon people that have some wild, radical conspiracies about Jeffrey Epstein. It misses the point to have that conversation because there's something legitimately nefarious that's happening that we just ignore, just completely ignore by refusing to address these issues head on. All right, that's George W. Bush, and I think most people now, including most conservatives, like I know a lot of people in the Libertarian Party, like our county affiliate that I'm involved in. There are two Marine veterans of the Iraq War, I think combat vets too, that went over there and kind of saw everything that happened firsthand, and that was kind of their big turning point to libertarianism. They're like, there's no need for us to be over here. Like we shouldn't be doing. And I know a lot of people in the military that have had similar experiences. They went over there for the absolute right reasons, very brave. They wanted to sacrifice for their country. country. They wanted to make a difference. And then they realized that these wars were completely unjust. All right. Well, Obama, when he was running for election, he promised to end these wars, and he won a Nobel Peace Prize because of how much he talked about trying to roll back America's war on terror. Obviously, that didn't go very well. But before we get into Obama's war crimes, let's go ahead and hear what they had to say about him and his spirituality on the Holy Post.
Obama, very different background than, Texas Methodist Church, like George W. Bush. Obama became a Christian in the context of working with Black churches in community organizing. So churches that are involved in a very different way in their communities. And the way he talked about his conversion was in some ways very evangelical. I mean, he spoke in very plain Orthodox Christian language about I needed a savior. I'm a sinner. I needed redemption. There is one way, it is Jesus. But he also talked about wanting the community of the church and wanting the community of the church to seek the good in the community that he was trying to seek. So in his presidency, he talked a lot more actually explicitly about Jesus. He mentioned Jesus in almost all of his National Prayer Breakfast speeches, including one time in which he talked about the nail-scarred hands of Jesus.
Yeah. Hold on. This is a quote. I just found this. This was in Christianity Today. He was being interviewed by CT. Obama said, "I am a Christian, and I am a devout Christian. I believe in the redemptive death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I believe that faith gives me a path to be cleansed of sin and have eternal life."
Mm-hmm. There you go.
That is a far more explicit gospel articulation than anything George W. Bush said during his presidency, which is nuts because that's not the way these two men are framed politically.
Right. Obama spent his entire presidency trying to convince the country that he wasn't Muslim. So it's that's wild.
Oh, man, Barack Obama, where to begin? Well, obviously, he did nothing to roll back the war on terror. Nothing at all. In fact, he wound up getting us involved in wars in 5 other countries: Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Libya, and Pakistan. Very, very violent, very, very deadly wars that killed millions, literally millions, of civilians. Completely innocent people, none of which had anything to do at all with 9/11 or the war on terror. They just happened to be in the Middle East at a time when America was committed to eradicating terror, whatever that even means. Barack Obama's biggest crime was his drone campaign. There's a really great article that sums this up. I'm listening to a book actually by Lori Calhoun right now called "We Kill Because We Can," which are all about the drone strike programs. I would highly recommend anyone that wants to follow this up read that book. It's incredible. But there's a really great article that I found. It was actually published, interestingly enough, the Harvard Political Review, which is it's heartening to see because you know that the Harvard Political Review is going to skew left. And even looking at some of the other headlines on the side of this article on the Harvard Political Review, you can tell this is a left-leaning publication. But the title of this article, which was published in 2021, is very simple. It says Barack Obama is a war criminal. I completely agree. And this article, I looked through a ton of articles. I was trying to find a good, succinct one that really sums up just how horrific Barack Obama's drone programs were. And this one does the best. So I'm going to read through this article real quick, and I just want you, as you sit there and think about this again. Imagine being able to have a calm conversation about Barack Obama's spiritual life without giving it the context of what he did to innocent people in the Middle East. So let's hear what this article has to say. All right, so this is Barack Obama's a war criminal. It says this. In 2009, the Norwegian Nobel Committee decided that the Nobel Peace Prize would go to a Harvard Law School graduate and elected junior senator of Illinois and the first black president of the United States, Barack Obama. According to the committee, Obama's vision of and work for a world without nuclear weapons served as the driving force that awarded him a Nobel. However, President Obama would go on to approve more drone strikes in his first year in office than President Bush carried out during his entire administration. The alleged peacemaker, very much like his predecessor, should be considered for the label of international war criminal. Let's clarify. President Obama is not a pioneer of the illegal and offensive wars that the United States has engaged in during the last 20 years. Even still, he is an expansionist, reflected clearly in the development of his drone program. During his presidency, Obama approved the use of 563 drone strikes that killed approximately 3,797 people. In fact, Obama authorized 54 drone strikes alone in Pakistan during his first year in office. In Pakistan. One of the first CIA drone strikes under President Obama was at a funeral, murdering as many as 41 Pakistani civilians. The following year, Obama led 128 CIA drone strikes in Pakistan that killed at least 89 civilians. Just 2 years into his presidency, it was clear that the hope that President Obama offered during his 2008 campaign could not escape U.S. imperialism. And again, just to frame, before I read the rest of the article here, there were a lot of people in the Middle East that were converted, that were radicalized to jihad, not because they believed it before the war on terror, but because we came over and murdered their family members. Right? I mean, that's the reason why they did it. And so imagine if you're the family member of somebody at that funeral where over 40 completely innocent people die. Over 40 completely innocent people died. You'd want to fight the United States too, right? And so these programs only created more of the terrorism that only caused us to go and fight and kill and drone and bomb more than we did before. All of this could have been completely avoided. So this article goes on. The drone operations extended to Somalia and Yemen in 2010 and 2011, resulting in more destructive results. Under the belief they were targeting al-Qaeda, President Obama's first strike on Yemen killed 55 people, including 21 children, 10 of which were under the age of 5. Additionally, 12 women, 5 of them pregnant, were also among those who were murdered in the strike. These blundered acts of murder by not only President Obama, but the U.S. government are morally reprehensible. Even more civilian casualties came out of Afghanistan throughout Barack Obama's time in office. In 2014, Obama began removing troops currently deployed in the country. However, instead of this action by the president being one in pursuit of peace and stability in the region, it only acted as an opportunity to drastically increase air warfare. Afghanistan had war rained upon them by U.S. bombardment, with the administration viciously dropping 1,337 weapons on Afghanistan in 2016. In total that year, the Obama administration dropped 26,000 bombs, drone or otherwise, across 7 countries: Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan. The U.S., in cooperation with its allies, including the Afghan government, killed 582 civilians on average annually from 2007 to 2016. That's just inexcusable. And I know that as Americans, we don't have to, unless you're a combat veteran, you've never had to deal with this personally yourself. So for us, these things happen on TV, and the Obama administration just chalked them up to collateral damage. Okay, this is the cost of war. But that's not good enough. Like, imagine if your child died in one of Obama's drone strikes innocently. You did nothing wrong. And with these drone strikes, and this is what Lori Calhoun talks about in her book, a lot of these drone strikes were based on information that was given to the United States government under enhanced interrogation. So you would have these guys that were illegally rendered, and they would be tortured by the CIA or by whichever part of the Department of Defense or whatever, intelligence agency had rendered them. And under torture, they give bad information, and then that bad information was the basis for these drone strikes. So a lot of the times, very innocent people were killed on the basis of bad information. Or you just happen to be spotted on a drone having a conversation with a neighbor who is a suspected jihadi, and then all of a sudden your house gets bombed. It's crazy. But again, he murdered. Barack Obama authorized. He murdered, and we should call it murder. This isn't just an accident. But he authorized drone strikes that directly killed thousands of civilians. The article goes on. In his recent self-aggrandizing memoir, A Promised Land, Obama defends his drone program through a messiah complex. He writes, "I wanted somehow to save them, and yet the world they were a part of and the machinery I commanded more often had me killing them instead." President Obama would have the reader believe he wanted to help the suspected terrorists, but simply couldn't. In reality, he consciously and undemocratically decided the fates of thousands of lives without due process. With the exception of the wars themselves, the claim that former President Barack Obama is a war criminal also lies with the Double Tap initiative. Double Tap drone strikes are as disturbing as they sound. These attacks are follow-up strikes on first responders as they rush to the bombed area, trying to assist any survivors. In 2012, an attack on the Sahal, I think that's how you pronounce it, Valley, aimed at Taliban commander Sadiq Noor, reportedly killed up to 14 people in a double tap drone strike. These attacks are both morally and legally reprehensible, as they are conscious acts of murder against civilians. These drone strikes make a strong case for categorizing Obama as an international war criminal. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, ratified by the United States, explicitly provides protections for not only the wounded, but also for medical and religious personnel, medical units, and medical transports. Article 8 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court states that intentionally directing attacks against personnel, installations, materials, units, or vehicles involved in humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping mission in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations is classified as a war crime. The law also states intentionally launching an attack and the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians also constitutes war crimes for the guilty party. Through the drone strike program and double tap attacks, there's no question that former President Obama and his administration violated international humanitarian law. Obama's symbolic significance cannot outshine his relationship with the imperial endeavors of the American empire. Again, just completely immoral. And the fact that we're not even allowed to have these conversations about our former presidents, and the fact that there are so many Christians, even progressive Christians, especially progressive Christians, that say that they're committed to social justice, that refuse to deal with these fundamental issues. Okay, so you might think that racism is a problem in the United States. You might think that women don't get treated very well in the workplace. You might think that there's work to go. Okay, that's fine. But why is it that we spend all of our time having conversations about that instead of having conversations about this? I think that this is way more significant because, again, lots of innocent people died. And all of these people that died in these wars on terror were brown people. They weren't white. So if you really believe in racial justice, why is it okay for George Bush and Barack Obama to bomb innocent people that had nothing to do with 9/11 under the false pretense that this is making us safe at home? None of that makes any sense at all whatsoever. I just don't get it. I just don't get it. It gets a lot worse with the Obama administration, though. So Obama in 2015 very famously made this nuclear deal with Iran. And Iran is a majority Shiite nation. So our number one backers in the Middle East, though, had been Saudi Arabia, which is a Sunni nation. So there was a government in Yemen, which has a border on the southwestern side of the Arabian Peninsula, borders Saudi Arabia. There was a government that was that was generally aligned with the Saudis, but that government was overthrown, and instead a new government formed in its place that was more allied with Iran. And Saudi Arabia and Iran are kind of like the two major competitors in that region. It's Shiite Iran versus Sunni Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia was furious with Barack Obama after allowing him to use their country as a base for the war on terror for years and years and years. They were furious, the Saudis were, that he would make a deal with Iran. And so this situation happened in Yemen where this government was no longer favorable to Saudi Arabia. And so they asked Barack Obama for help, which he gave them. He gave them money to wage this war in Yemen, and then he placed a blockade over Yemen as well. But no one in Yemen had anything to do with 9/11. And this blockade led to the death by starvation and by dehydration of, based on some estimates, nearly 500,000 people. Like hundreds of thousands of people died because of this. All because we had to placate the Saudis because we made a deal with Iran. And had we not been involved in the politics of the Middle East, then none of that would have happened as well. And we had this blockade in place for a long time. And in fact, in 2019, there was a bill that was passed through both houses of Congress that would have ended the United States support for the Saudi war in Yemen, which was just brutal and violent, completely illegal from top to bottom. And Donald Trump vetoed it. So he's a war criminal too. And the last thing that I want to leave on, because I think there's one more really great, and I'm gonna post a link to the full article. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but over at The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, who's a really great, he's kind of left leaning, but he's really great on war and a lot of other issues. He has a really good article that was written a few years ago about how Barack Obama killed a 16-year-old American citizen in Yemen, and Donald Trump also killed his sister. Right, and both of these are horrible war crimes. All right, so in 2010, President Obama directed the CIA to assassinate an American citizen in Yemen, Anwar al-Awlaki, despite the fact that he'd never been charged with, let alone convicted of any crime, and the agency successfully carried out that order a year later with a September 2011 drone strike. So again, Barack Obama authorized a drone strike against an American citizen who has the right to due process, but instead of getting due processed, he was just murdered by the government outright. While the assassination created widespread debate, the once again beloved ACLU sued Obama to restrain him from the assassination on the ground of due process, and then, when that suit was dismissed, sued Obama again after the killing was carried out. Another drone killing carried out shortly thereafter was perhaps even more significant, yet generated relatively little attention. 2 weeks after the killing of al-Awlaki, a separate CIA drone strike in Yemen killed his 16-year-old American-born son, Abdul Rahman, along with the boy's 17-year-old cousin and several other innocent Yemenis. The U.S. eventually claimed that the boy was not their target, but merely collateral damage. Abdul Rahman's grief-stricken grandfather, Nasser al-Awlaki, urged the Washington Post to visit a Facebook memorial page for Abdul Rahman, which he explained, "Look at his pictures, his friends, and his hobbies. His Facebook page shows a typical kid." Few events pulled the mask off of Obama officials like this one. It highlighted how the Obama administration was ravaging Yemen, one of the world's poorest countries. Just weeks after he won the Nobel Prize, Obama used cluster bombs that killed 35 Yemeni women and children. Even Obama-supporting liberal comedians mocked the arguments of the Obama DOJ for why it had the right to execute Americans with no charges. The U.S. assault on Yemeni civilians not only continued, but radically escalated over the next 5 years through the end of the Obama presidency as the U.S. and the U.K. armed, supported, and provided crucial assistance to their close ally Saudi Arabia as it devastated Yemen through a criminally reckless bombing campaign. Yemen now faces mass starvation, seemingly exacerbated deliberately by the U.S.-UK supported air attacks. Because of the West's direct responsibility for these atrocities, they have received vanishing little attention in these responsible countries. In a hideous symbol of the bipartisan continuity of U.S. barbarism, Nasser al-Awlaki just lost another one of his young grandchildren to U.S. violence. On Sunday, and this is in 2017, so during the Trump administration, the Navy SEAL Team 6, using armed Reaper drones for cover, carried out a commando raid on what it was said was a compound harboring officials of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. A statement issued by President Trump lamented the death of an American service member and several others who were wounded, but made no mention of any civilian deaths. But reports from Yemen quickly surfaced that 30 were killed, including 10 women and children. Among the dead, the 8-year-old granddaughter of Nasser al-Awlaki, Nawar, who is also the daughter of Anwar al-Awlaki. So again, just completely unnecessary. And I'll leave the link to that article so you can read the rest of it. There was a recent survey that was done, a recent study that was done by Brown University, where they tried to quantify just how many people have died in the war on terror. And they estimate that about 900,000 people have been killed as a direct result of U.S. guns and bombs and tanks and drones and all of those things in the 20 years that we've been at war in the Middle East. But what Brown University did was they tried to look at the excess death rate. So the deaths that were caused by famine, by starvation, by homelessness, by lack of proper sanitation, not having enough access to medical care and all of those things. And their estimates is that nearly 3,500,000 people have died in the Middle East, most of them completely innocent because of our U.S. intervention that was supported by Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden. All of them were deeply involved in the war on terror. All of it was criminal, and none of it had anything to do with actually bringing the perpetrators of 9/11 to justice. And for that, every single U.S. president in the last 20 years, and probably more than that, Bill Clinton was a war criminal too. Oh, that's a story for another day. But every single U.S. president should be in prison for this, at the very least. And this is what's so frustrating, I think, to me about this is what was so frustrating to me as I listened to the Holy Post podcast. It's not that issue is not important, and it's not that we shouldn't talk about the spirituality of our presidents. Although I think that for a lot of people that are kind of red-pilled on this, like me, a lot of people that don't believe in the mainstream narrative and that actually see that there are a lot of connections between the pundit class and the political class. You know, you're someone like what's his name, George Stephanopoulos, who worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign and then went and worked for ABC, pushing all this government propaganda. Like, they're not giving us the truth. And at the very least, even if they're not deliberately, I mean, I think they're deliberately lying to us. I think the media class is, but even if they're not deliberately lying to us, let's take a mainstream position on this. Even if they're not deliberately lying to us, they're not allowing us to talk about these fundamental issues. And so it's crazy that so many people would celebrate the arrest of Donald Trump and his mugshot and all of the things that are going on with that right now. But they refuse to talk about the absolute devastation that Bush and Obama unleashed on completely innocent people in the Middle East. And this Holy Post episode was a great example of that. I really do believe that as Christians, being against war in all of its forms, and especially being against the American military machine, because right now the United States is the global empire, and there's no other civilization in the 21st century that has caused more death and destruction than the United States. We as Christians have to speak out against this. And I know that it's very difficult for people like the podcasters at the Holy Post to dive deeper into these issues because they're always associated with conspiracy theories. But the empirical evidence is out there. It's not a conspiracy theory. Like, it's not a conspiracy theory that these happened. These things actually happened, and we should be screaming at the top of our lungs about these things. Because not only did they kill 4.5 million innocent, mostly innocent people in the Middle East, but we also lost 7,000 U.S. servicemen, men and women who were cut down in the prime of their life, and then 30,000 more have committed suicide as a result of being involved in these terror wars. And all of it was for basically nothing. We lost Afghanistan. We were there for 20 years, and then we pulled out, and Afghanistan was right back where it was before. Just wild to me. And so I guess the main point of what I'm saying is this, just to wrap this all up and get us out of here today. I appreciate the fact that there are institutions within Christianity, within mainstream American Christianity, like the Holy Post, and they really are a high watermark. Like this is not meant to be critical of them, because there's no one really within mainstream American Christianity outside of us at the Libertarian Christian Institute that are screaming bloody murder about the wars that took place in the Middle East. There's no one doing that. And I appreciate that the Holy Post is at least trying to push the envelope and deal with political issues in a more complex way, in a way that actually benefits these issues. But we can see how easy it is. We can see how easy it is to get pulled back into the mainstream narrative. We can see how easy it is to fall back on the talking points that have been given to us by the politicians that are trying to avoid being labeled as war criminals. But in my mind, like as Christians, we should expect more, and we should be complaining and screaming about the right things. Okay, you want to have your conversations about the racism and the sexism and all that kind of stuff, that's fine. But you don't really believe in justice if you are not willing to critique all of the evils that the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and then of course Trump and Biden, have inflicted on completely innocent people throughout the Middle East. You just can't do it. You just can't do it. This is not going to be the last time I talk about this issue on the show. It's definitely not the first. I've done a lot of anti-war episodes, and as I promised on Twitter at the very beginning of this year, I wanted to do more episodes on biblical studies and more episodes on war, and man, I've been delivering on my promises all year long. There's a lot more that could be said about this. Again, I'm going to put links to everything that I discussed in the show. For those of you guys, especially if you are new to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, you're coming over here because I'm talking about the Holy Post. I really do hope you check out some of these resources. I'm going to put links to both of the articles that I looked at on the show. I'm going to put links to the Brown University study that demonstrates how many excess deaths were created by the War on Terror. I'm going to put links to Scott Horton's book, which is an absolute must-read enough already. I can't express enough just how important that is. And of course, I'm going to put a link to the podcast. Again, as I said before, they brought up some very important issues at the end of the podcast, but I just feel like we are so distracted. We're so distracted by what we're told to talk about by the media that it winds up putting us in a position where we actually ignore what's important. So I hope you follow up on some of these resources. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, and we will be back next Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.